Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith and you're watching another episode of Overbooked here on the channel. This is the series where I talk about every single book on my shelves because the world is doomed, I tell you. Doomed! Today we are talking about N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy. Some quick disclaimers before we start. I bought all the books in this series myself. This is my slipcase. As you will see, I am missing book one. It is somewhere in the house. I have looked for it. I can't find it anywhere. It's definitely here. It's been taken by some kind of book gremlin. It'll turn up eventually. But I did buy all of these books myself, regardless of where books come from. Nobody's paying me to talk about books except my patrons, and all opinions are my own. I'm going to keep this as spoiler-free as humanly possible while still talking about the trilogy as a whole. If you do want to go in knowing absolutely nothing, pause the video. Come back when you've read it, we'll talk then. And I will link the story graph down below in case you want to check out any user-generated content warnings. This is one of those series where I recommend that you do that. This is a speculative fiction series that came out between 2015 and 2017, which doesn't feel that long ago, and yet when you think about it, kind of is, by N.K. Jemisin. If you don't know who N.K. Jemisin is, we've talked about her a bunch on the channel. I've got some videos up for some of her other series that you can go and check out if I remember to link something here. Very prolific writer, has won a lot of awards. Winner of 3 Hugo Awards, shortlisted for World Fantasy, Nebula, Kitschy's, Audie and Locus Awards. So very award-winning series, very well known. I first read it many years ago, probably 2019, I want to say, maybe earlier than that. A dear friend recommended them to me. I read them. I liked them. But at that time, I was still very much in my reading mostly YA era, and I feel like I've upgraded. Not that reading YA is bad, we've talked about this before, but I think for me it requires a different mental muscle to read adult fantasy, and I've definitely developed that muscle much more now. So this was a reread, but a very welcome one. There are 3 books in this series. We have the 5th season, The Obelisk Gate and The Stone Sky. These are set on a planet with a supercontinent called the Stillness. In this place, every few centuries or so, there is a cataclysmic event, usually climate change related, that is called the 5th season. The people who survive those seasons do so because of wisdom passed down by other survivors of other seasons, and one of the things that gets passed down is the hatred of origins or orogenies. I'm not totally sure, and I did do the audiobooks and I still can't remember which one it is. People who can manipulate tectonic energy, essentially. It's a lot to do with earthquakes and the movements of plates and volcanoes and that kind of thing. In book 1, because it would spoil things if I talked about anything else, we follow different characters across different perspectives and timelines in the lead up to a cataclysmic event. I would kind of very, very shorthand describe this as a book about how people survive in an apocalypse when the apocalypse is expected, perhaps, and what people will do to survive. Maybe? My favourite thing I like about this series in particular is the world building. I think it's really well done. It's one of those books where you learn more about it as the characters learn more about it and as they travel across the world. And also your understanding of it develops across all 3 books. There's a lot of mysteries to do with the world that get solved, and it's just very interesting world building, but also the kind of cultures of people, the prejudices of people. That's a huge theme in this book. The different ways in which people survive and have survived, very interesting. I love the emphasis on history and oral history versus written history. In terms of both like the physical setting and the cultural setting, I think N.K. Jemisin knocks it out of the park. I think it's her strongest world building, probably other than The Great Cities duology, which is obviously drawing on the real world, so is a very different beast. The first time I read these books, I was slightly confused by book 1 because there's a lot of playing with time and also playing with perspective and playing with what's the voice? So we get a lot in second person across all 3 books, which is not something I'm typically used to reading. So the first time I read it, very confused, didn't necessarily understand what was going on all the time. A second read and a reread by audio, that's the secret for me, really worked. I just think that it's such an interesting way of telling a story, of playing with format, creating dramatic irony and creating mystery. I think it's done very well. I've seen it done very badly in other books that have just been a very confused mess, but in this case I think N.K. Jemisin plots it out so perfectly that everything just works. It just works so well. You definitely get my favourite thing, which I feel like I talk about all the time, but that thing of the reader solving the mystery 2 pages before the character does always works for me and definitely appears in this. I want to touch on the characters in this. I think N.K. Jemisin does such a good job of creating really compelling characters. Not necessarily characters that you absolutely love or characters that you agree with all the time, but just really complicated characters that are nonetheless enjoyable to be in their headspace and to experience their life and their choices. There's a huge theme of parenthood across these books, which is in there from the beginning of book one, and I think really embraces the fact that parenthood on its own is incredibly complicated and difficult. Parenthood in an apocalypse, nigh on impossible. And there's a lot to do with grace and redemption and when redemption is warranted and earned and so such. It's just very interesting themes around that all tie into how the characters are portrayed. I also thought the way the book explored abuse and control and fear as themes through these characters and this plot was very well handled. I think it does a really good job of exploring that both on the kind of one-on-one perspective and on a more global, continental, larger group of people scale. This is not something that surprised me. N.K. Jemisin has always been very good at drawing out themes in her books that are applicable to the modern day or applicable to anything really. But I think in this case, the way that big and small scale exploration of the theme hits, it's really hit me this time around. To bear in mind, if you're planning on picking up this book, I would say that for me, if you're a person who reads very similar to me, I needed multiple reads to really get it. I think the first time that I read them, I was like, whoa, this is too... I'm going to use the word highbrow. I think that is how I felt at the time. And reading them back this time around, I was like, these are solid fantasy books. There's some interesting stuff in here. There's thematic things that we're getting at, but it's not that different from other stuff that I'm reading, and I think possibly it was just that it was at the time. I was surprised on a reread by how much I appreciated the individual plots of each book, and I got much more of a sense of the arc of each book, which I hadn't got the first time around. So just to bear in mind, might be the kind of thing that you want to read once and then reread again in the future. I would recommend the audio. I think the audiobooks were fantastic. Just for me personally, that really helps slow down my reading and help me absorb a book a bit more than if I read it physically. Also, if you're planning on reading this, pay attention. That sounds really silly, but you know how there are some books where you can kind of mindlessly just let the story flow over you? In this, because of all of those shifts in perspective and because of the kind of various mysteries that you have to hold on to, I would suggest keeping a closer eye on things, holding on to some of those plot threads, just bearing things in mind. I know that sounds really silly, and it's advice that I'm giving myself for reading in the future, which is just pay attention a bit more. And lastly, if you are planning on reading this, I did say at the beginning of the video, but do check out the content warnings before you pick this up. There are some difficult things to deal with, especially around those themes of parenthood and abuse in the book. And yes, as I say, Storygraph will be linked if you want to check those out. Other things you might want to read, if you've not read any N.K. Jemisin before and you're wanting to explore more, I would probably pick up, most similar to this, I think, is The Inheritance Trilogy? Is that what it's called? I can't remember, but I have a video up for that. And I really like that, and I think it has a lot of similarity with this in terms of the mystery and the world building and so such. My favourite of hers is actually The Great Cities Duology, which we're going to talk about next week. Just knock my glasses off my face, why don't I? If you're wanting alternate authors, I think the way in which this book blends fantasy and sci-fi elements, I would maybe look at something like Winnowing Flame, which is a fantastic trilogy by Jen Williams. It's just wonderful. I highly recommend it. And in terms of a book that explores trauma in the way that this book does, I wondered about maybe the Poppy War trilogy, which I know a lot of people don't talk about because a lot of people didn't get on with book 3. And book 1 has a lot of difficult stuff you have to get through, but I think thematically it's got some really interesting parallels with this book. Overall, should you read? Absolutely, yes, you should. It's one of the best, in my opinion, fantasy trilogies, fantasy, speculative fiction, science fiction out there. It's just so interesting and so well done and so different from everything else that I think it really just hits home. It really works. I'm a huge fan of N.K. Jemisin. It's been a joy to get to reread some of her stuff this year and just to kind of get through her whole catalogue over the last couple of years. It's just been great. I love it so much. Have you read these? Do you have plans to? Let me know down in the comments below. While you're down there commenting, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It makes me feel loved and appreciated. You can also come hang out on Discord where we have chill chats about books. I'd like to say an enormous thank you to all the ghosts who haunt me over on Patreon. They support the channel and in return get early access to videos, bonus content, live streams and more. If you'd like to join their number, that's linked below as well. Thank you so much to you for watching. That's all from me and I will see you in the next one. There's gonna be some bloopers now. My door's opening. I must close it before the echo gets terrible.